You've heard me say here many times before, I grew up the only son of a single mom. And so the influences in my life were a little different than they were for a lot of other people. I also grew up in a house full of women because I had two sisters and my mom at home, and that was it.
Welcome to Leading Leaders Podcast, 5-minute videos, 5 days a week.
I'm Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast. One of the questions that has always struck me in these mentor conversations that I have with young people is, and it's really funny too, because the context of the television series called SWAT has been kind of playing around the edges of this as well, even though they're not really playing around the edges of it, they're digging right into it. One of the officers is rebuilding his relationship with his dad. And his dad is now struggling with cancer, and his dad has moved back in with him, and he's trying to help take care of his dad. But his dad left when he was a teenager, and they had no kind of relationship. Well, now there's a young man who's kind of come into their life, and the officer has adopted him, and he's trying to help him get things worked out. And this young man gets a girl pregnant. And her parents are determined, we're going to have the baby, but you're not going to have anything to do with the baby's life. And so they're walking through this very delicately, from the legal aspect, from the emotional aspect, from the parental aspect, from who has legal rights. They're both teenagers, they're both minors. Now there's a baby. Who has the right to determine who sees the baby? And all of the nonsense that goes around that makes it really hard for two young people who are really very immature in the ways of understanding the world to even figure out what to do with the relationship. And you might ask yourself, what in the world does this have to do with leadership? And I have to be honest and say, if you're asking that question, you might need to go back to square one and start over again, because here's the reality. John Maxwell says leadership is influence, nothing more and nothing less. But the amount of influence that a father has in his child's life is enormous. And I don't just mean how he talks to them, whether he yells at them or he doesn't yell at them, whether he scolds them or doesn't scold them, whether he relies on corporal punishment or timeout. Yes, all of those things will impact the way the child raises themselves in life. It will determine at what point they become independent. It will determine at what point they either have a respect for authority or they don't. They find themselves in trouble or they don't. They find a way to navigate through tough times or they don't. All of those things are going to be impacted by the way they're parented. And if it's grandparents doing that, it's going to be a little different than if it's mom and dad. And if mom and dad are not together because it's a baby daddy, baby mama kind of relationship, then it's going to be a train wreck. I know this. I've seen this. My parents were divorced when I was 4. My mom was widowed when I was 9. No male role models in my life. I had no curfew. By the time I was 13 years old, I had my own keys to the house and my own keys to the car. I came and went as I pleased. And trust me, there was a season of my life that I look back on now and I go, it's a miracle I'm alive. It's a miracle I'm not in jail somewhere. It's a miracle that I had any kind of common sense at all by the time that period of my life was over. And I'm being very serious, not facetious when I say that. I can imagine, though, I can only imagine, taking that same set of circumstances and putting it on someone who lives in an inner city. I was in a small rural town in the middle of nowhere. The worst trouble I could get into is drinking and messing with cows. Bring that into an inner city where you're surrounded by dozens, if not hundreds of other people in exactly the same scenario. There's not really dad or mom at home yelling at you about what time to be home. You got to find some way to make it on the streets, living in an urban environment. And everybody around you has figured out how to make money, how to get in trouble, how to stay out of jail, how to get in jail and get back out again. They've figured these things out, and that becomes your schooling, that becomes your raising. Even if you are going to school, those relationships are what's raising you. That's a tough place to be in. But when mom and dad keep their teen children from being parents as they're supposed to be, they neither get to grow up themselves, nor do they raise this child. And now we have 2 or 3 generations impacted by this lack of fatherhood. That, my friends, is leadership. That's a leadership problem. Everybody from Ben Carson to the latest people on the most diverse talk shows, the most liberal and the most conservative, they have pretty much the same rules. And that is, Ben Shapiro has even said the same thing. Look, if you want to be successful in life, finish high school, don't have babies until you're married, get a job and keep the job, meaning don't move from one job to the next job until you've got the second job lined up. Constant employment, babies after you're married, finish your education. That's not complicated stuff for most people. Those three are pretty much the bare minimum. But we have a society today all around the world where babies are appearing long before education is done, and babies are appearing long before marriage comes along. And when you put those two things together, having steady employment is going to be near impossible. That's a leadership problem. That's a leadership problem from the generation looking to those young people and from that generation looking to the babies. Now it's going to be really hard to say, don't get pregnant out of wedlock. Well, you did, Mom. You were 13. It's really hard to pull that one off, right? As young men, as young leaders, it's absolutely critical that we begin to set some of those established values, determine for ourselves what we want, and begin to build a future. Even if you've made that mistake, even if you've had a child out of wedlock, now is not the time to go, well, sorry, I screwed that up, and not even try. Now is the time to say, how do I do better from here? How do I make sure that I invest in that young person, that baby, that elementary age student, that teenager, that young adult as they grow up, and help them find those foundations? And try to stick to those three rules. Larry Elder, Ben Shapiro, Ben Carson, they've all said the same thing. Don't have babies before you're married. Finish your high school education. Get a job and keep a job. Those three things will alleviate poverty all over the world. And that is a leadership problem. I'm Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast for Tell It Like It Is TV. Have a blessed day.
Subscribe now to our extensive video library of leadership lessons promoting faith, family, and freedom.